Disney movies wouldn't be the same without their villains. They create tension, drive plots, and give protagonists something to fight against. And villains also have a unique queer history. LGBTQ people have always been portrayed as outsiders or threats to society, but the modern practice of queer coding came during the Hays Code in the early to mid-20th century, when there were moral guidelines for US film studios. Put simply, after a while, being vaguely effeminate and other queer stereotypes got mixed together with just villainy, creating the modern queer-coded villain who appears in a lot of Disney films. I wouldn't say this is good, explicit queer representation, but I wouldn't say that it's inherently bad either. I see a lot of modern takes on queer coding that seem to only view it from one perspective.
This created a blueprint for a villain that's become ingrained. Disney loved this trope, often depicting evil characters as camp and effeminate compared to more masculine heroes.
I don't necessarily disagree, but I do think there's a difference between a character like Captain Hook, who was basically a predatory stereotype about gay men, and Ursula, a character explicitly based on a drag queen who was queer-coded in part by an openly gay man. I think queer people having agency over doing what they want with their narratives is more important than the exact ways in which they do it. And queer people should also have agency to interact with these characters however they want to. If you're interested, I've actually already made a video about why queerness and villainy can work together. But when talking about queer-coded Disney villains, I see one always left out of the mix. And it just so happens that this one has the gayest Disney villain song.
No one's slick as Gaston, no one's quick as Gaston, no one's neck's as incredibly thick as Gaston, for there's no man in town half as manly, perfect, a pure paragon. You can ask any Tom, Dick, or Stanley, and they'll tell you whose team they'd prefer to be on.
In Disney's original Beauty and the Beast, Gaston is kind of the main representation of society's problems. Not only does he pressure Belle to marry him and freak out when she declines his request, but he's also the main drive for the society othering and trying to kill the Beast. That's what makes him such an effective villain. Disney's Beauty and the Beast is a story about two outsiders who are ostracized for different reasons, but ultimately the result of a villain and society that, well... We don't like what we don't understand, in fact it scares us. But there's more to the story. Though Gaston might seem like a viscerally heterosexual man, there was also a different intention hidden below the surface, and thanks to a 2017 interview with Bill Condon, the director of the live-action Beauty and the Beast, we have more context. Condon continues. I'll tell you one other thing that's for sure. I'm not saying Howard Ashman liked rough trade, but Alan Menken told me that both The Dentist and Little Shop of Horrors and Gaston were based on, trade. So the uber-masculine Gaston with his bulging muscles and hairy chest was the kind of man Ashman fantasized about? Yeah, or had been with, says Condon. Not the brightest, but lovely, That's a gay joke. That's a gay inside joke, that character, Gaston. But what does trade mean? In modern queer culture, it's a word that has many different meanings. If you watch RuPaul's Drag Race, you might think that it just means someone who's attractive.
So the queens are talking about having some trade amongst them. Priyanka, who do you think is the trade of the season?
However, that's not what it used to mean, and that certainly wasn't what it meant when Beauty and the Beast was being made. The exact origin is unsure, but there have been a few different uses of trade in queer culture over the years. In the counterculture slang language Polari, often used by gay people, it just referred to sex. However, over the years, it picked up new contexts. In US American scenes, it became associated with men who, for all intents and purposes, could pass as straight or other masculine archetypes, but still had queer sex. Because of these uses, trade became shorthand for someone who was just really masculine. And conversely, rough trade is basically the same thing, but just another way to emphasize the ruggedness of a man. And that makes sense for the Dentist in Little Shop of Horrors, who is very much rough trade. And the same could be said for Gaston, so Alan Menken saying that gives us a lot of context. Masculinity has a complicated queer history. On one hand, things like Beefcake and other glorifications of masculinity have been important outlets for queer people to express themselves and fight a society that demeaned them through stereotypical patriarchal gender roles. And during the AIDS crisis, hypermasculine images were also a way to combat stereotypes about gay men being diseased or weak. On the other hand, though, masculinity in gay communities has also been at the center of misogyny, fascism, white nationalism, and even queerphobia. When being hypermasculine is viewed as some type of noble ideal, anyone who strays from that becomes a disgrace. So masculinity is a complicated thing that can both empower and suppress queer people. And when trade is involved, it's especially clear. Masculinity can be a pleasure, but also a threat. But what does this have to do with Gaston? Well, his self-titled villain song is not just a celebration of masculinity, but a glorification of it. And even though there are women characters who fawn over him, they barely have any lines in a song that's mostly just men loving a man for masculine reasons.
No one fights like Gaston, douses lights like Gaston. In a wrestling match, nobody bites like Gaston, for there's no one as burly and brawny. As you see, I've got biceps to spare. Not an inch of him scraggly or scrawny, that's right. And every last inch of me's covered with hair.
Heteronormative societies love masculinity, but often the existence of masculinity within those contexts implies that there is a feminine counterpart. However, by leaving that out, you can express queerness without doing so in a way that's necessarily opposed to mainstream society. I've always joked that Gaston is like a Disney-fied version of Macho Man by the Village People. Though they're often thought of as a gay group, not much about the Village People was explicit. There have been multiple heterosexual members, and many songs don't explicitly mean what people think they mean. In other words, you could say the group is queer-coded, but not in a derogatory way.
Every man wants to be a macho man.
The way that Gaston glorifies masculinity from a male gaze only makes more sense when you consider that the character himself was a gay joke. Now, that doesn't really affect the story of Beauty and the Beast, but it does give us more insight into his queer coding. And given that collaborators and those close to Howard Ashman have spoken about the movie's use of allegory and how that potentially relates to his experience as a gay man during the AIDS crisis, it's interesting to see one queer-coded character, Gaston, demonize another, the Beast. But why did Bill Condon bring this up in a 2017 interview? Well, that was promotion for the live-action version of the movie that also leaned into queer-coding, albeit in a different way. Gaston's sidekick LeFou is queer-coded in a way that's just comic relief. The film was marketed as having a quote-unquote exclusively gay moment, but that just ended up being a few glances and inflections that hint at LeFou being in love with Gaston, but not really saying anything. And ironically enough, LeFou's queer coding kind of undermines the original queer coding of Gaston. Because LeFou's queerness is just a joke about him being gay and not having his love reciprocated, it relies on Gaston appearing as an oblivious, hypermasculine, and heterosexual foil.
Exactly, who needs her when you've got us?
And to be clear, I don't think the original queer coding nor the 2017 version are the types of representation that I want to fight for. And given how much progress has been made with queer rights since the original 1991 film, the 2017 blink and you'll miss it quote-unquote exclusively gay moment just feels performative, even though Bill Condon is an openly gay man. But I think it's important that we don't assume that inadequate representation is the same thing as problematic representation. When I see people including Ursula in their lists of problematic queer-coded Disney villains, I feel like Howard Ashman's perspective as an openly gay man deliberately putting queer aesthetics into a Disney film is ignored, when instead I'd say that it was a step forward in reclaiming agency. And at the end of the day, it's less important to me how queer people implement representation, and more so just important that they have complete control over how they do so. So who knows what Howard Ashman would have done if he had complete control over the image and brand of Disney in the late 80s and early 90s. But I think conflating that type of queer coding with characters who are made to disparage and perpetuate stereotypes about LGBTQ people would be missing a lot of nuance. And with a song like Gaston, it's nice to have queer people telling their own jokes for once.
When I was a lad, I ate 4 dozen eggs every morning to help me get large. But now that I'm grown, I eat 5 dozen eggs, so I'm practically as large as a large.
Okay, so you know they're gay, right?
I mean, it's obvious. We're all listening to these lyrics together.
We're on the same page as this together, yeah.
Gay as hell, right?
Yeah, alright.
Gay as hell.
No one shoots like